Welcome to the Israel Daily News Podcast. I'm your host, Shanna Fold, and I'm here to get you caught up quickly. I've got some top news stories for you today from Israel, and guess what? You're listening, so you're already on top of your game. Survive and thrive, people. Knowledge is the best weapon. Today is Monday, December 1st, 2025 in the Gregorian calendar, and the 12th of Kislev, 5786 in the Hebrew calendar. In today's episode, we are going to cover one topic and one topic only. After some 6 years of being under investigation and trial, Prime Minister Netanyahu has officially asked President Isaac Herzog for a pardon. And it's a pardon in advance because Netanyahu's trial has not gotten a judgment at this point. To discuss this at length, I'm bringing in a legal expert named Benyamin Moalem. But before we get to his deep dive, as we're calling it, I'll get you the facts on the ground because that's what I do best. On Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu published a video with a personal plea to President Isaac Herzog for a pardon. Sources close to the Prime Minister say that he would not consider a plea deal that would require him to retire from politics and that he intends to run again for the next election, while sources close to Herzog reveal that a decision could take at least 2 months. Earlier this month, U.S. President Donald Trump sent a letter to President Herzog also urging him to pardon Netanyahu and called the Prime Minister's corruption trial, quote, political and unjustified. President Herzog released a statement on Monday saying that he will, quote, only consider the good of the state and address the significant implications it can carry. Netanyahu's attorney, Amit Haddad, formally delivered the request to the president's office legal department and now has been transferred to the Justice Ministry's Pardons Department. The assessments are then going to be forwarded to the president's legal advisor, who will prepare additional recommendations for Herzog before Herzog, our president, makes a final decision. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been on trial since May 2020 after being indicted in 2019 in 3 separate cases known as Case 1000, Case 2000, and Case 4000. He's charged with 1 count of bribery and 3 counts of fraud and breach of trust. He has pleaded not guilty and has denied any wrongdoing. Prime Minister Netanyahu is accused of taking money from close associates in order to do them business favors, as well as accepting fancy gifts in the form of champagne and cigars, and also trying to sway the press to give good coverage. That's also a part of it. There's more to this, but I'll leave the rest to our expert. Benyamin Moalem is deeply engaged in Israeli current events and policy discussions. Having worked as a foreign law clerk at the Supreme Court of Israel, he has a unique vantage point on Israeli jurisprudence. Benyamin now devotes much of his time to curating and explaining current events and politics in Israel on his popular Instagram page by Moalem, where he provides balanced news coverage from an Israeli perspective for those seeking to be informed without an extensive time investment. Benjamin has authored several thought-provoking featured op-eds and has been featured as a guest lecturer at Bar Ilan University in Israel. Let's get him on the show. Welcome to the show, Benjamin. Thank you for joining us again for this deep dive episode on the Israel Daily News. Today we are going to talk about the pardon that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has asked the president of Israel to fulfill. And you were pretty jazzed up about this story, were you not?
Well, like everyone in Israel, this was quite the bombshell. It was unclear if the prime minister was actually going to ask for it. As we know that in the past few weeks, President Trump has been lobbying for this pardon to be granted. However, under Israeli law, President Herzog in this case, can only grant a pardon or consider a pardon if one is requested by the defendant himself, or an immediate family member with the knowledge of the defendant, or of course, an attorney representing the defendants. So for the first time now, the prime minister has formally requested one, and it was quite a request. He provided a 111-page legal filing for the attorneys that work with President Herzog to review, as well as a one-page personalized letter pleading his case to the president.
Very interesting. 110 pages. Yes, that rolled across my desk today, all in Hebrew. Took a look through it, but I'm so glad to have you to break down those 110 pages for
Well, I
us.
have to be honest, I did not read the entire 111-page report, but we have more or less an idea of what he's requesting and what he is notably not asking for in the or admitting to in the filings.
Got it. Okay, so first of all, I'd like you to take us through the charges that Netanyahu is on trial for, because I think that it's a really big part of public opinion. And I'd like you to take us through the charges and why each of them are significant.
Sure. So, aside from the fact that Netanyahu, as a politician or public figure in Israel, is quite divisive in terms of where you fall on, what you think of him. But aside from that, of course, is the criminal charges against him, and we've got three cases that are pending against him, and each case has a number of charges that he's being accused of. So, in number one is what's called Case 1000. In Case 1000, he allegedly received gifts from Arnon Milchan, who was a Hollywood mogul based in the United States, but originally Israeli. He's friends with the Netanyahu family, and the prime minister allegedly received gifts in the form of champagne and cigars in exchange for helping him out with his visa in the United States and pulling some favors for him with the Secretary of State, among other things. And for this, he's being charged with breach of trust and fraud, meaning breaching the trust that he has as a public figure and kind of using it to pull strings for somebody who's giving him something in return, which is not bribery. We'll get to that in a second. At least not under Israeli law. Bribery is a much more serious charge. There's Case 2000. This is where Netanyahu allegedly offered to support a bill in the Knesset that would help Yediot Aharonot, which is Israel's second largest newspaper in Israel after Yisrael Hayom. Yisrael Hayom is an upstart newspaper that really only rose to prominence and really only began in the last 15 years and is given away for free, whereas Yediot Aharonot is people have to pay for it. So while Yediot Aharonot was for a long time the number one read newspaper in Israel, Yisrael Hayom quickly overtook it, and Yisrael Hayom does have a right-wing bend and is considered by many, it's funded by the Adelson family and considered to be a newspaper that supports the prime minister. So, according to the allegations in Case 2000, the prime minister offered to support a law in the Knesset, which never passed in the end, but to support a law in the Knesset that would, he allegedly offered to support this law that would have made it very difficult for Yisrael Hayom to distribute the newspaper, and which would be beneficial for Yediot Aharonot. In exchange, he allegedly wanted more positive coverage from the newspaper. The details of the case, we can go a lot more in depth there, but more or less that's the case. He's being charged with breach of trust and fraud in that case. Then you've got Case 4000. You might be asking what happened in Case 3000. There was another case where the prime minister was being investigated regarding some submarines that were ordered from Germany, but the prosecutor decided not to press charges in that case. Then we get to Case 4000. This is the most serious of the cases that against the prime minister, where he's being charged with not only breach of trust and fraud, but bribery as well. The prime minister, when he not only was prime minister, but also served as communications minister, offered to okay a merger between the owners of the Walla media outlet in exchange for positive media coverage from that outlet. Now, this media outlet they wanted to combine with Bezeq, a big communications company in Israel, and they wanted the regulations made easier for them to be able to do this business deal, and allegedly in exchange, the prime minister wanted positive coverage on the Walla news outlet. Notably, the district court, which is hearing the trial right now, has already indicated that it does not believe that there is enough evidence to even consider the charge of bribery in that case, and have urged the prosecution to drop that charge. The prosecution has refused. They've been adamant that they could prove that the prime minister is guilty of bribery. That's where we're holding today. This is a trial that's been going on for years and is expected to go on for several more years. It has been not only dominating the headlines in Israel because of, who's on trial here, but keep in mind, this is the Prime Minister of Israel, who also now is expected to show up to court 3 days a week to testify. He's already done this for quite a period of time where he was on direct examination. Now he's being cross-examined. And the prime minister's argument in his petition for a pardon is this is not good for the country. I can't be expected to sit in court for, 6 hours a day and then run the country at the same time. That's why it's in the best interest of the country that the president step in and issue the pardon and end this whole trial so that he can get on with being prime minister. And he argues that, he's was elected in democratic elections by the people of Israel to run the country, whether people think he's guilty or not. A majority of people, and his argument would be that, or at least the majority of people want him to be prime minister based on the previous elections, not according to polls currently, and therefore he should be allowed to finish his term and run for re-election next year. Or, yeah, next year.
Very, very comprehensive. Thank you for taking us through all of that. I personally think that it's very important to go through all of that. What is your analysis and your thought in response to the concept that the prime minister can't be devoting so much of his time to being in court while he has the enormous task of running the state of Israel?
Well, I think that everybody there, whether you're a supporter of the prime minister or an opponent of the prime minister, you'd have to agree that being prime minister of Israel is a lot more than a full-time job. This is famously only sleeps about 4 hours a night or so. Not recommended for anybody, let alone somebody who's in his mid-70s and facing certain health issues. Now, besides the point, meaning they'll agree this is not the most ideal situation. There's nobody who'll say like this is an ideal situation, but many people, especially his opponents, would say, well, he should be treated no differently than any other person, meaning he was charged with a crime and the legal process should play itself out. And if he's guilty, then he should have to face the consequences of his actions. Now, his supporters would say, well, he's being railroaded by people who are his political enemies, and these charges are trumped up, or they're making a bigger deal out of the charges than they are. Again, that's for the courts to decide. The problem is also another problem in Israel. This goes beyond the prime minister is how slowly these cases wind through the courts and the legal justice system. And this has been a problem in Israel for a very long time, and perhaps a topic for another podcast. But famously, cases, especially cases against high-profile defendants, take a very long time, which many might argue this is, regardless of whether a person's guilty or not, nobody should be subjected to such a long legal process to determine their fate.
Very, very interesting. I actually think this is the point of the case that personally, as a journalist, catches my interest, just because I think that it's so important for there to be freedom of the press. And this is, these are just allegations, but I think that for me personally, out of all of these charges, this is the charge about the communications programs and the communications businesses here in Israel. This is the one that has my attention the most.
Yeah, it's important to have free press, of course, and Israel probably has more laws that regulate that than the United States does. At least at this point, they're looking to reform some of those laws. But yeah, freedom of press is a very essential part of any democracy.
So the other things, which I would like you to also touch on, the champagne, the cigars, most people that I've spoken to or I've heard from will say, oh, come on, every foreign leader gets cigars, gets champagne, gets treated nicely, gets presents. Why would Netanyahu be treated any differently? Can you respond to that?
Well, again, it depends where you fall out on this. Netanyahu's argument is Arnon Milchan was my friend, and friends give each other gifts. He knows that Netanyahu's wife likes certain wine, Netanyahu, the prime minister, likes certain cigars, and he was sending them to him because he has the means and he's friends with him, so he would send it to him. And as a friend, whatever happened with the State Department and, he phoned in a favor for him, there was no quid pro quo here is what the prime minister's defense is. The prosecutor is saying, well, no, there was a quid pro quo here. You would not have received these gifts. You would not have gotten all these different things, meaning he clearly was giving them to you in exchange for certain favors that he wanted from you because of your position as prime minister, and that is breach of trust because of your position in the government. And ultimately, the judges would have to decide whether, who to believe.
Excellent. Thanks for taking us through that. Now, explain to us what is the response to Prime Minister Netanyahu asking outright for a pardon. And the reason I ask that is because Benjamin, you and I are both really following this story, but is the average Israeli, tuned in to what's going on here? Do they care?
So I think the average Israeli does care. What their opinion of what should happen might vary from person to person. This is clearly a story that's going to be watched by, I think, Israelis, whether they understand the nuances of the legal issues involved or not. We've got supporters of the prime minister who want to see the pardon go through. You've even got some supporters of the prime minister more on a fringe who don't want to see a pardon because they want to see him getting acquitted in court. Though most of those who support the prime minister want to see the pardon go through, they want to see this story go away and not be on the headlines anymore and let the prime minister do what he's got to be doing because, whether he did it or not, we don't care from the perspective of those. You've got people on the opponents of the prime minister who think this is absolutely absurd. Why is it that somebody who is facing charges and, including a charge of bribery, who's a public servant, being allowed to walk without even having to face a trial to find out whether he committed the crimes he's being accused of or not? They would argue that it might be undemocratic. Many of your listeners who are based in the United States, where the pardon power of the president is different than the pardon power in Israel. The pardon power of President Trump, for example, is a lot more vast than that President Herzog has in Israel. It's not uncommon, especially in the last few years between Trump and Biden, where we saw a lot of preemptive pardons. Before he left office, President Biden issued a number of preemptive pardons for people for covering large swaths of time without any specific, even crime being suspected of those people during those times. President Trump can wake up one morning and decide, hey, I don't like the way this guy was being treated. I'm going to pardon him. In Israel, as we spoke about, there's a lot more criteria for how a pardon can be sought. In fact, this is only the second time in Israel's history that a preemptive pardon is being sought by the president of Israel. Typically, pardons are sought by people who've been convicted. They might be in jail. They might be facing a sentence. And then the president might chime in and decide whether or not to give a pardon. But this is only the second time that a preemptive pardon has even been sought in Israel's history. The first one being in 1986, I believe, when President Isaac Herzog's father, Chaim Herzog, was president, and he pardoned a couple of Shin Bet agents who were facing trial for allegedly killing two terrorists after they had been apprehended during an attempt to take a bus full of passengers hostage and carrying out a terrorist attack. They had been apprehended and then they allegedly executed them after they had been apprehended. They were facing trial. There was a whole host of an alleged cover-up following that whole thing. It's called the Bus 300 case in 1984. Ultimately, they admitted to wrongdoing and apologized, and he issued a pardon in that case.
Very, very interesting. So, in terms of this preemptive thing, I think it's interesting that you're talking about a preemptive pardon. Certainly, it's something that most people, when they hear about a pardon, it's usually to get somebody out of jail who's already in jail, who's already been convicted. So this really is interesting. One thing that I want to ask you about is, would you say that it looks like Prime Minister Netanyahu is admitting that he's guilty by requesting this pardon?
So this is something that's being debated, right? Only somebody who's guilty of something would ask for a pardon. That's what some might argue and say, the request for a pardon in and of itself is kind of an admission of guilt. Others will say, well, it's not. He's got to face a trial, and he doesn't want this on his plate. He doesn't want to deal with all this right now. So he's saying, like, wipe it away, cancel the legal proceedings, and let me move on with my life and move on with running the country. So that's a debate. And also legally, there's a debate here as to whether he needs to admit to wrongdoing or not. Especially at this point, at this stage of the pardon process, at the preemptive. We had one of his former lawyers, actually, from several years ago, recently was interviewed yesterday, I believe, and he said that he would have to admit to wrongdoing in order to receive a pardon. The Israel Democracy Institute issued an opinion last night saying that he would not, at least not legally, what the president does or might require of the prime minister in exchange for a pardon. That might be something else that we can talk about shortly. But yeah, this is largely uncharted territory when it comes to pardon power, a prime minister on trial. Like, all these things are very new in terms of what the legal system has to say about it. All we know is that the Supreme Court in 1986, after Chaim Herzog pardoned those men, they said that a preemptive pardon is okay, but only under the most extreme or extenuating circumstances. There's probably a very good argument to make that this is an extenuating circumstance, and we're talking about the prime minister here. But if Herzog does decide to issue a pardon, even if it's a pardon with caveats or strings attached, you could probably assume that this will end up in court. There will be some sort of NGO that will decide this is not right, and we need the Supreme Court to chime in on this, which is something that in Israel can be done, where you have a third party can petition to the Supreme Court and argue that a government decision is wrong.
Very, very interesting, which lends to why some people feel strongly about making changes to the way that the judiciary system is run here in Israel, so that things like that where a third party can come in or where the Supreme Court can make a ruling on something that other people thought was going to be said and done, that could be changed. Is that right? That's why people feel a sense of urgency in changing processes here?
That's one of the things. The judicial reform maybe goes through a lot of different, there's a lot of different factors involved as to why people want to reform the judiciary or why people are opposed to any reform of the judiciary or want some other form of reform, but not the one the government wants. But one of them could be made that there's a judicial overreach, at least for those who want reform, and say that judiciary should not have standing and have a say in every single decision made by the government because certain powers are reserved for the other branches of government and not the court, and the court shouldn't have a say in everything.
So interesting. There was something that you mentioned just earlier that you'd like to get into more. What was that?
Oh, so I was talking about what might the president do, meaning the President Herzog here is between a rock and a hard place in many ways. The office of the President of Israel is something that is supposed to be above politics. He's supposed to be a unifier. And whatever decision he takes here, it's going to upset some people on one side of this debate, and not a position that the president wants to be in, typically. So there's a few things that he would need to consider. He already said that he will have his legal team, look into the petition in depth. Remember, 111 pages. I'm sure there'll be a lot of lawyers involved, and they're going to go through it and make a recommendation to the president. And then the president will have to make a decision. He said that his only consideration will be the best interest of the people of Israel. That's what we know from what he said. Now, there have been reports, and based on things he said over the past several months or even years, that suggest that he's inclined to offer some sort of pardon. He feels that the trial is not good for the state of Israel. He wants this headache to go away. The question is, how does he do this in the least controversial way possible? There was one report yesterday quoting sources close to the president's residence, suggesting that he would offer a pardon, however, with strings attached. Some of the strings that were suggested would be that he would want some sort of admission of guilt or apology from the prime minister. Number one. Number two, he would want the prime minister to resign now, but allow him to run for re-election in November. So meaning, let's say he makes this decision in 2 months from now, prime minister would resign according to this report, would resign in February and then be allowed to run again in November when in the next elections. I'd say that's unlikely that the prime minister is going to agree to do that. You might recall, some of your listeners may recall that about three or 4 years ago, the prosecution was in advanced negotiations with the prime minister for a plea bargain. Now, this was being mediated by none other than Aaron Barak, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Israel, worldwide renowned jurist, and he supports a plea bargain. He thinks that this trial is bad, and he's not viewed as a friend of the government, by the way. Former Supreme Court president is viewed by many as a very progressive judge and not politically aligned. Not that he's a politician, but not aligned ideologically with the prime minister. And for that matter, President Herzog isn't either. He used to be the head of the Labor Party, which is in the opposition. So he was the opposition leader when Netanyahu was prime minister. But in those plea bargain negotiations, reports say that they were very close to a deal by which the prime minister would plead guilty to some of the lesser charges, like a breach of trust or fraud charge. And he would receive some slap on the wrist like probation, which the prime minister agreed to. The only thing the prime minister would not agree to is the insistence of the prosecution that any crime that he plead guilty to carry with what's called moral turpitude. And crimes that have moral turpitude by Israeli law bar the defendant from participating in politics for 7 years. So this would have basically told Netanyahu, pretty much your political career is over, but you cannot come back to politics for 7 years. Netanyahu said, absolutely not. I will not accept any deal by which I cannot remain in politics. So we see that Netanyahu might be ready to apologize if that's what it takes to get a pardon, to acknowledge some sort of wrongdoing, the language of which can be discussed. But he didn't apologize or admit to any wrongdoing in his letter to the president. But for him, this is the beginning of the negotiation. So he might go that far and say, I did some things that aren't right. I apologize for it. But he's not going to agree to be barred from politics for 7 years, and probably not agree to even a suspension of a few months pending the next election. So what will probably happen, I'm inclined to believe that there will be some sort of yes, but, meaning Herzog will offer a pardon on the condition that Netanyahu does something. Now, what that is the big what if. Does he say, listen, you need to admit to wrongdoing, you need to apologize? In that case, a pardon might work through. Then, of course, that's going to be subject to judicial review. But in the event he says you need to step down, even for a short period of time, I would say it's I don't see the prime minister doing that. So we'll it'll be several weeks before we hear from the president what his final decision is in the matter.
Very, very interesting, and also a tough place to be in as the president of Israel, being that his role is to maintain his relationships with everybody within the country. And he also got into his role because of his strong relationships globally. He has a lot of global influence. People like him a lot in all corners of the world.
Yes, he's well liked, and I actually have met him a couple of times, and he's a very nice, down to earth guy. Like, no, he just seems like a nice guy. He seems relatable. So,
One thing I actually want to note about the president is that just today there was another report from a former hostage who said that nobody from the government, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, had reached out to him. And upon his return, he was in captivity for just under 500 days. He's an elderly man named Gadi Moses, and he, spoke to the press and said that nobody had contacted him, nobody had reached out, and that in fact, foreign official, the ambassador of Germany, came to visit him in the hospital, and that it was President Herzog was the only official from Israel that phoned him while he was in his recovery. So I think that speaks volumes about where President Herzog sees himself as the individual who makes that phone call, who shows up to that thing, who displays his feeling and his emotion for the people of Israel. So I just wanted to note that so that the listeners can kind of get a sense of the person that we're dealing with who's going to have to make this call and how he's viewed here in Israel. Benjamin, is there anything that we did not go through in this interview that you want to share relating to Prime Minister Netanyahu requesting a pardon from President Herzog?
I believe we covered everything. I think the one thing people should be aware of is that the office of the president in Israel is a largely ceremonial role. And one of the very few actual powers the president has is the pardon power. So he's officially the head of state in Israel. Power-wise, that's mostly rests in the hands of the prime minister, who really runs the country. So this pardon power is a big deal for the president, and especially something this explosive in terms of what the issue is. This is something that he's not going to be able to take lightly.
Benjamin, are you familiar with how the role of president came to be within the state of Israel? Could you share with us a little bit about that?
I believe that it's basically modeled around the Queen or the King of England, just like meaning while the President of Israel is not the sovereign is the people. Similar to the way remember Israel used to be a British colony before Israel gained its independence, and the idea is similar to like while the King of England ceremonially is the head of state, the power rests with the prime minister, and that's similar to the way it works in Israel.
Very fascinating. Thank you again, Benyamin Moalem, for coming with us today, giving us the legal
Sure.
expertise, a little analysis, and we'll be back with you on the next hot issue.
All right, thank you very much.